All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the last session of NCFS Unbound, last session of 22-23. But fear not, the next season is already in the works, and we hope you'll join us. I wanted to thank Rachel Mesch and Susan McCready, of course, my wonderful co-conveners of this seminar. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Sharon Larson and Margot Irvine. They will be discussing Sharon's new book, Resurrecting Jane de la Vaudère, Literary Shapeshifter of the Belle Époque, that was published with Penn State Press. Sharon Larson is Associate Professor of French at Christopher Newport University. Her research examines representations of femininity in decadent and naturalist literatures, as well as medical discourses on sexual difference in the late 19th century. She has published articles in 19th century French studies, Women in French Studies, 19, Excavatio, L'érudit franco-espagnol, 19th century context, and Nottingham French Studies. And as I mentioned, her new book, Resurrecting Jane de la Vaudère, was published in December with Penn State Press. And she's going to be in conversation with Margot Irvine, who is an associate professor in the School of Languages and Literatures at the University of Guelph, where she teaches in the French and European Studies programs. She is interested in women's access to literary and cultural institutions in France. She's currently preparing a biography of Judith Cladel, a late 19th century author, journalist, and founder of the Rodin Museum. With Kimberly Francis, she is the co-editor of Creative Women of the Lost Generation, Women in the Arts in the Wake of the Great War, forthcoming with Routledge in 2024. And with Frédéric Arroyas, she is the co-founder and co-editor-in-chief of the journal Nouvelle Revue Synergie Canada. So I will turn it over to Sharon first, who is going to give a brief introduction to her book, and then there will be a conversation between Margot and Sharon, and then at the end we will turn. We will invite you to ask your questions, and please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. So.
Thank you, Masha and Susan and Rachel, as always, for connecting us and for organizing this wonderful series. And thank you, Margot, for being in conversation with me today and for agreeing to talk with me about Jane de la Vaudère. I see that there are a lot of people in the room today that have been instrumental in this book coming together. And it's really exciting to see everybody's black boxes with their names. So hopefully I'll see your faces at some point. So this book is part biography, part literary analysis, and part homage to the people that I have met along the way in my 5 years or so of research. To start, I want to give you guys a little bit of general background on Jane de la Vaudère, for those of you who don't know much about her. These are some of the most exciting discoveries I made while I was doing my research. So the question is, who was Jane de la Vaudère? To begin, she was a prolific writer. She wrote more than 40 novels, poetry collections, and dramatic works, as well as hundreds of press editorials and short stories throughout her career. And she was also a frequent plagiarist, as some critics had already discovered during her lifetime. Today, with the use of modern plagiarism software, I have yet to find a novel by La Vaudère that does not contain passages lifted from 19th century literary or scientific texts. And this is just a small list of the writers, traces of whom I've found in her works, and there are many more, I'm certain of it. She's also the original author of Missy and Colette's Rêve d'Égypte. So those of you probably recall the famous, or I guess I should say infamous, night at the Moulin Rouge when Colette and Missy de Morny, who were lovers in real life, kissed on stage during a pantomime and a production of Rêve d'Égypte. And it led to the suspension of future productions and a lot of good, well, bad press, which is good press, I'll argue in a little bit. And Vaudère was actually the original author of this pantomime. Missy had stolen it from the Moulin Rouge, where she had circulated it. And she was a complicated feminist. She advocated for marriage and divorce reform in her work, as well as sexual fulfillment for married women, which was a pretty modern and progressive position. But she also denounced organized feminist movements in her fiction. And she parodied a lot of well-known activists. The contradictions of her feminism actually bled into her personal life. This was probably one of my favorite discoveries along the way. Vaudère had found some letters that were exchanged between her husband and his mistress. She took the letters, she marched to divorce court, and she demanded a divorce. And this was the Jugement de Divorce that I was able to find in the Archives de Paris. It dates from 1898. And what was interesting about this was not only that this was a woman demanding divorce just 14 years or so after the law had been reinstated, but her argument for divorce was very strategic. She claimed that she was forced to write in order to support her son, who was 22 years old at the time, forced to write to support her son because her husband had spent her dowry on his mistress and had abandoned the family. So she presented herself as a wonderful mother, and that's why she was a writer. The subtitle of the book is Literary Shapeshifter of the Belle Époque. So what do I mean by that? I think what makes Vaudère so unique is what I like to think of as this chameleon-like adaptability to evolving literary and social trends. If we take a look at the diversity of her collected works, we can see the sort of shape-shifting throughout her career that really exemplifies her continual transformation and instinct for the literary market. I argue that she transcended classification because she inhabited multiple genres. She wrote poetry, short stories, plays, novels, editorials, and she also transcended classification within literary movements. She was an author of naturalist, decadent, Orientalist fiction, popular fiction. She also incessantly shaped and reworked her persona in interviews and photo montages. I'm going to show you a few photos in just a second. All of this construction of a persona began with her name, Jeanne de la Vaudère, which she took from the chateau that she lived in with her husband. So two opposing depictions of Vaudère dominated the press throughout her career. In the early years, when she was writing what I like to call sentimental verse poetry, she was considered a very docile and unassuming young woman. She was lauded for her feminine grace and charm. Her poetry was not great. It was very hackneyed and cliched, but it was a manifestation of her femininity. And then later in her career, especially around after 1897, we see this shift in her writing, as well as a shift in how she's portrayed in the press. Around 1897, in the years that follow until her death in 1908, she was seen as this debauched, unscrupulous bas-bleu who was set out to obliterate the gendered social order. This all started really with Les Demi-Sexes, which was a novel about Parisian women who had their ovaries removed in order to be able to have sex like men without the risk of getting pregnant. And these were the works that sold. Vaudère took a risk in rebranding herself, and it worked. So after this time, we see a new thematic interest in sexual pathologies in her work, as well as unconventional gender expression. These are themes we also see in naturalist and decadent fiction. So we have these provocative titles around this time: Les Demi-Sexes, Folie d'Opium, Les Androgynes, Le Harem de Cita, Sappho Donteuse. These are just a few of the titles that really reflected this new provocative shift that she had created for herself. And she tapped into the selling power of these images. As her works grew more risque, as I've said, her public image also grew more disconcerting, and the newspapers talked more about her. And in exchange, her books started selling even more. So what I argue about the selling power is that she actually reappropriated a lot of this negative press and used it to her advantage and exploited it. So here are some images just to give you a sense of the different, the varied iconography of Vaudère. We see her in Orientalist clothing to advertise one of her theatrical pieces. There she is in a car. She is in a gown. There's a very meek image of her with her fan and her dress, sitting at a desk writing with a lion's pelt at her feet, a statue of Venus with her breasts exposed above her, and then sitting in her salon with a wide range of Orientalist objects. So speaking of Orientalism, in 1900, she turned to Orientalist erotic fiction, and this coincided with the Exposition Universelle. And these works, there was about a series of 12 of them. They featured accounts of historic figures. They were fictionalized accounts and portrayed exotic ancient customs of countries like Japan, India, Egypt, and Turkey. And this was through an Orientalist lens that accentuated practices of gratuitous violence and unbridled sexuality in these countries. These moments were described in meticulous detail. They're actually often plagiarized. But we see these detailed scenes of torture. We see orgies, murder, human sacrifice, rape, incest, prostitution. And as I said, these works, they sold very well. And the third stage in her writing career was the photo literature that appeared in very close to the end of her life in 1907, 1908. And there were a series of 3 novels that she published with Marican through the Librairie d'Art Technique, which had photos which were taken d'après nature. And these were titillating photos of often nude women that supposedly supplemented the plot line, but really it was another way to market these works that already had a very titillating content. So her rebranding from going from the very docile to the troubling persona signaled an astute awareness of evolving trends in the literary market and an awareness of the value of curating her image. She was rumored to have said towards the end of her life about erotic literature, haha, cela vous dégoûte, il n'y a pourtant que cela qui se vende. So she recognized the paradox, she recognized the irony. And this brings us back to her plagiarism a bit, which for me does not at all disqualify her from serious academic attention. On the contrary, I think her plagiarism really facilitated her malleability and ability to move between genres, between different literary movements, and also to really tap into this fluidity that she had as a public figure. And also to engage with these male-authored discourses on gender difference, through plagiarism. So I'm going to bring in an allegory about a mummy right now, and you'll see why in a second. I think that she was very mummy-like in the use of her plagiarism. She sort of wrapped herself in what I think of as a patchwork of different voices, and drew from a myriad of different discourses. So let's talk about mummies. Mummies are central to this study in literal and metaphorical form. I visited the Château de la Vaudère, where she lived, and there's a burial chapel on the property, and it houses a few members of La Vaudère's extended family, and these members have actually been embalmed. This is her grandmother, who's on the property, and you can see the viewing window. And then her mother-in-law and an unidentified family member. You can see traces of the craniotomy where they removed the brain from the skull. So why am I talking about mummies today? So in 19th century France, the practice of embalmment was available to affluent families like La Vaudère's, and it provided the possibility of preserving the body of a deceased loved one through chemical compounds, evisceration, and dehydration. The scientists, the embalmers, were able to impede the natural process of decay. And through artificial intervention, embalmers indulged the idea of immortality and a way for the body to live on, but in an altered form. They reworked and transformed the corpse. The final product was just a mere shell of the original. Mummies are both dead and alive. They bear traces of both the original and the new. They undergo continual recontextualization. So I hope you see the link here with the plagiarism. I think the plagiarism functions in the same way. I think it transforms an original text into a modified format and molds what came before. And of course, more broadly, it's a nice reminder of the importance of this work of preservation, a resurrection, if you will, that's at the heart of this study. So a little word about the contents of the book. Chapter 1, the makings of a biography. This is the foundation of the book. It's a detailed profile of Vaudère's life. There has been no extensive biography of Vaudère up until this time. There's little bits and pieces here and there, very fragmentary accounts. Some of them are erroneous. And I thought this was a really important starting off point to trace the development of her complicated persona and possibly connect it to moments in her personal life. Chapter 2 is a complement to chapter 1. In chapter 2, I look at the representation of her often one-dimensional persona in the press and in roman à clés. And I also see her as active in this construction. I see her as having agency. I look at her marketing tactics that exploited her troubling reputation in order to sell more books. And as I said before, I also examine the mutability of her persona and her performances of different iterations of womanhood that also expose their fragility, their precariousness, and the arbitrariness of gender codes. Chapter 3 and 4 are both on plagiarism. Those were also fun chapters to write. So we know Vaudère was a plagiarist, but I'm more interested in looking at how this served her creatively. So chapter 3 reads the trends of plagiarism in her novel Les Demi-Sexes through a feminist lens. I look at 2 works by Maupassant that she heavily plagiarized, Notre Cœur, a novel, and his travel memoirs, La Sicile. And for me, these acts of plagiarism were not just about copying. I think that Les Demi-Sexes actually reappropriates Maupassant's very one-dimensional, essentialist, conventional depictions of womanhood and femininity, and through copying these passages, Vaudère actually exposes their precariousness and proposes new models of womanhood. So I think she's really engaging with Maupassant's cliched images of femininity and of the femme fatale as we see in Notre Cœur. Chapter 4, the plagiarized plagiarist, looks at Vaudère as a victim of plagiarism. And as I said before, she claimed to have been, and I'm convinced she claimed to have been the original author of Missy and Colette's Rêve d'Égypte, which was very scandalous at the time, got them a lot of publicity. Vaudère had circulated her pantomime, the original of which does not exist, but I was able to find what I believe is a trace of it in one of her novels that she reproduces. And what I've discovered was there actually was not a lesbian subplot in Vaudère's original pantomime that she had circulated, which means that Missy and Colette added that when they did their production. In return, Vaudère piggybacked on their scandal and published a novella version a few months after the Moulin Rouge production that also featured a lesbian subplot. So I see this as an exchange, as a constant series of revisions and new ways of being in dialogue, rather than just a question of creative theft. Chapter 5 considers her fierce feminism, and that comes from a quote that she claimed herself to be a féministe farouche later in her life, but over about 15 years, her dialogue, her exchange with feminism within her works was very complicated. At times she was considered very conservative, at times she was considered very radical. La Fronde, the famous feminist newspaper run by Marguerite Durand, claimed that she was an anti-feminist. But there's many feminist themes in her works. She advocates for divorce and marriage reform. She's very interested in how heterosexual courtship really benefits the man, and that women are not sexually fulfilled in marriage. So I divide this part into 3 sections. First part focuses on her engagement with contemporary feminist movements, her use of the term féministe in her work. Then I look at her critique of marital conventions and divorce laws. And finally, I look at her adoption of mediumism and spiritist conceptions of gender difference. The last chapter brings us back to the present day, and I talk about the lasting legacy at the Château de la Vaudère and how La Vaudère is remembered in her village of Gagny-l'Évêque. And the point of departure for this final section is a photograph from the Carnet de la Femme of La Vaudère seated behind the wheel of a car. I can't confirm that she was one of the pioneer motorists of the period. She often wrote about automobiles in her writing. She linked them to female emancipation, to sexual freedom of women. But what perhaps was most exciting about this find was when I visited the Château de la Vaudère, the current owner, her name is Anne-Charlotte Rousseau, is actually an aficionado of vintage automobiles. And she's one of only a handful of women to compete in international rally racing. So this final chapter examines the history of the Château de la Vaudère and its lineage of autonomous women, their cars, and emancipation afforded through driving. And finally, I end with a comprehensive bibliography of La Vaudère's publications. There's hundreds of bibliographic information on there. It's first of its kind, and it's still not complete. It's ever growing. I'm constantly finding new, as more and more journals are being, newspapers are being digitized. I'm finding more and more writing by her. So the resources in this book have been widespread and varied. They range from rare archival documents from the 19th century to personal connections that have formed more recently. And I want to just end by saying that her gravestone at Montparnasse is unmarked. And I think there's something very symbolic about this erasure. And it's my hope that this book, the first and hopefully many of its kind, can serve as a headstone of sorts with her story engraved in its pages. And I will stop there.
Thank you, Sharon. All right, oh, here you are. Okay, hold.
Well, thank you, Sharon. Maybe I'll just jump in. This was a fabulous book. I had so much fun reading it. I'm just going to hold it up here so that you can see my copy here. But and it seems like it's something that you had a lot of fun writing as well. We learned, not only about Jeanne de la Vaudère, and you give us a lot of tools so that the research on her can continue with the big annotated or the big bibliography of her works that you include. You give us a lot of images of her, some of which you've shown us here, some archival documents. One that I'm just going to mention is the letter from her husband authorizing her to join the Société des gens de lettres. I'd never seen anything like that before, and it was really interesting to see a document like that. And it, in addition to being a biography of her, it touches on so many other interesting things. Questions of literary copyright and plagiarism, mediumism, spiritualism, embalming practices, women's driving practices. It seems like it really took you in all sorts of different places, and I was amazed at all the things that you had to learn to cover as well in order to write it. It was, it just seemed like a lot of fun. So I kind of organized my questions to take us through the book, so I'll just go in that way. And so one of the difficulties that you faced in writing the book is the lack of archival documents about La Vaudère. And I wanted to ask you why you think there are so few documents that are left about her or by her. And do you think that it was because she was so independent from different literary and feminist circles that she was excluded, or that the records are not there?
Thank you so much. And I'm glad you had as much fun reading it as I did writing it. I'm so glad you're asking this question because there's been a development. Well, I should start by saying, for those who haven't read the book, I spend a significant amount of time explaining the disappearance of her archives. There are no manuscripts, there are no letters. There's an occasional letter on eBay that I've been able to find, occasional letter in random archives throughout France, but there's no comprehensive collection of La Vaudère's manuscripts. I mean, they had to have been somewhere. So the question was, And I looked everywhere. I followed every possible piece there could be. The question was, where are they? Either they weren't conserved and they were lost because they weren't deemed important, or they were destroyed. So why would they be destroyed? There was a rumor that Vaudère's mother-in-law might have burned them in the courtyard at the chateau because of her reputation. She was considered very eccentric. And then there's also the possibility that she had a rift with a family member. One of the things I discovered in my research was that on her deathbed, she amended her will to include, she claimed that she wanted to give all of her manuscripts, or give a selection of manuscripts to Théodore Cahu, who was another writer who was a good friend of hers. I think they were probably more than friends. She gave him her manuscripts from her deathbed. Can't find them; they're gone. I've contacted his archives. They're just not there either. And then the second thing that she indicated in this amended will was she was going to give her sister Marie, her older sister Marie, a portrait of herself, of Vaudère, that was worth 50 francs. So this is a woman who came from a very honorable family, and the one thing she's leaving her sister is her own portrait. So this was a symbolic gesture. Marie also refused it, which was an equally symbolic gesture. She said, "I have no need for a portrait of my sister." It's just a little comment in the margins of this amended will, and I think it points to this potential rift between family members. So I spent a lot of time in this book documenting my belief that her archives had been destroyed, and I think it's also part of this story, the Resurrecting Jane de la Vaudère. And it works really well with the mummies, and it was just, So the good and bad news is a week before the book came out in December, I was made aware of a tweet. I'm not on Twitter, and I think I should be. A tweet from the Archives Nationales claiming they were doing a challenge representing autrices théâtrales from the 19th century, starting with A to Z. And they were going through their boxes and finding manuscripts that hadn't been inventoried yet. So when the letter V came around, it was Vaudère's turn. And I now know that the Archives Nationales has 5 manuscripts of some of her theatrical works that were performed. So I read about this. I was so excited and also so frustrated because this is a week before the book comes out, and I spent a lot of time working on this. But what I've come to realize through the chain of events is that this is just the beginning. I don't think her manuscripts have been destroyed. I think they're in a dusty box somewhere. I've written to the archives twice. I've asked them what is going on. Where did you find these? Is there more? And they haven't written back. So if anyone has any suggestions, I know Melanie, you're out there. She's the great sleuth. If you have any suggestions, I would love to get in there. I don't know how feasible that is, but I do think they're out there. I think it's also important just to note that the Archives Nationales indicated that they had something like 30,000 of these manuscripts. So they're there. They just don't have the person power to unpack them. They don't, maybe there wasn't a priority. Vaudère has not been a priority, but now we're starting to see more and more interest in her, with this book, but also I've had grad students in France email me with questions. They're working on her. Gallica continues to digitize her works, and Snuggly Books now has a series of her works that have been translated by Brian Stableford. So her works are now, available to Anglophone readers. Michael Scrive, who's in the room, who's a long descendant of Vaudère. Yes, we have a descendant of Vaudère here with us today. He runs Vaudère's Twitter account, and I don't know the exact number, but he has hundreds of followers, and he's in constant contact. We call this the réseau vaudérien that we're creating. There are a lot of people who are working on her now, and I'm hoping that just this momentum will renew an interest and to find out what are in those boxes.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's really exciting. It's great to hear that, that's what you hope from a book, that the research is just going to continue.
Yeah. And I am glad I was wrong. I'm so thrilled. So
that's great. In chapter 1, The Makings of a Biography, you set out the biographical facts about Jeanne de la Vaudère based on the sources that were available to you. Do you want to talk a little bit about which sources were particularly helpful in constructing that chapter, and which sources you would have liked to find that you couldn't?
Yeah, so the cold hard facts, I call them, right? Her marriage certificate, her birth certificate, her will, all those notary documents, those were instrumental in writing her biography and putting the pieces together. She lived part-time in Paris, part-time in Paris-L'Évêque. So I looked at multiple archives in Paris, the Archives Nationales, the Archives de Paris. And I also looked at the archives in Le Mans, the Archives départementales de la Sarthe. And these were really good for family history, looking at her finances, that sort of thing. But they didn't say much about her professional progression. In terms of tracing her trajectory, at the Archives Nationales in Pierrefitte-sur-Seine, they contain all the Société des gens de lettres dossier, all the files, and they have a selection of her letters that document how she first became a member. She was very naive when she first applied for membership. She said, can you just tell me a little bit about what you do? I want to be a member, but I'm not even sure what you do. And then, within a decade, she was coming to them for help, for representation when there was an editor at a newspaper that wouldn't return her manuscript, that wouldn't give her appropriate compensation. So we can see this not just in terms of her professional trajectory, but also her coming into her own autonomy, really, as a writer, as a professional. The Hôtel Massa in Paris also has the original records of the committee deliberations, whether when they were deciding whether or not she should be admitted. And then, of course, when I was looking at her reputation, Gallica was a gold mine. It was really, I'm just so grateful for all of the reportage, the press exposés that have been done about her, the book reviews that appeared in Gallica, this occasional image. And again, I think there's more to come. Retro News, I don't know if you're familiar with that. That's also, there's a lot of new journals, new newspapers that are being digitized. But really, I think my most important source on a human level was other people. I was amazed at the kindness of strangers. I was amazed at the piste that random a cemetery groundskeeper would give me, or when I went to the Château de la Vaudère, there was a group of car enthusiasts who were trying to help me identify the type of car she was driving in that photo. I went to the bibliothèque at the Opéra, desperately looking for this, what I call the needle in the haystack, this proof that she had indeed been the original author of Missy and Colette's pantomime. And I looked everywhere. It was my needle in the haystack. And a random archivist at the opera said, "You should go look at the SACD." And I said, "What's that?" And he told me, and I went there, and there it was. That was the needle in the haystack. And so, again, it's this human connection. Michael Scrive, who's in the room, has been my partner in this in a lot of ways. He's been so helpful with, we've been sharing information for the last 5 years, constantly emailing each other. And a lot of these people have become friends, which has been really, really wonderful. A lot of this work requires speculation, and it's been interesting hearing different people's takes, different people's interpretations. And Margot, you had said to me in an email correspondence, it's really kind of cool that she was so scandalous, because people talked about her, and there are rumors, and regardless of whether those rumors are true or not, it doesn't really matter, because it all feeds into her legacy and her persona, and who she was and who the public thought she was, which I think she also, obviously was very instrumental in that self-construction. So yes, that's the short answer.
That's great. Yeah, no, it's very cool how people seem to, we often think we work on these 19th century authors who have been long dead, and yet there still are like little traces of memory in different places. And it's really fun to be able to pull on those sometimes in different ways. It's descendants or documents or, local memories and things. So it's really good. So I want to ask about in chapter 3, to get into her plagiarism a little bit more, because it's this is a really interesting and again, one of the fun chapters of the book is when you analyze her plagiarism of Maupassant. And you show very convincingly that she challenges male-authored, one-dimensional and stereotyped notions of femininity in her rewritings. You quote Marilyn Randall, who uses the term guerrilla plagiarism, and I thought that that's a great expression to sort of describe what La Vaudère is doing. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about how you discovered the plagiarism and what led you to develop that analysis of her plagiarism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I was writing an article for Women in French Studies. They were doing a special issue on women in travel. And La Vaudère, her novel Les Demi-Sexes, there's a 60-page episode where the protagonist goes to Sicily on her honeymoon. I'm actually going to Sicily on my honeymoon in July, but she goes to Sicily on her honeymoon. And there's these long descriptions of the Sicilian coastline, and it's really at this in the Mediterranean landscape that she has this moral restoration, and she decides that she does in fact want to have a baby, even though her ovaries have been removed. And I'm reading these descriptions, and I'm realizing that they sound very familiar. And it occurred to me that only a couple of weeks earlier, I had just been skimming Maupassant's travel memoirs. I don't even remember why. And I realized that those passages were actually reproduced and, stolen, if you want to call it, from him. And I did some research. Marlo Johnson is the Maupassant expert. There's no trace that the two knew each other or corresponded. They were both at the same they're both at Ollendorf, but I'm sure they crossed paths. But I thought it was really interesting that she, quote unquote, got away with this. So I didn't want to simply look at it as a question of ethics or dismiss her as not being a serious writer, because the content of the two works is it's so interesting how she links essentialist ideas of femininity with this coastline that is actually Maupassant's writing. And so it's this very weird paradox where she's going back to natural femininity in this description, but it's artificial. It's been copied from somebody who there's a lot at play, and I think it really showed the fragility of these ideas, as well as of the texts themselves in a lot of ways. So I started looking at other works, and I realized that she had a pattern, to say the least. And I became really, really good at if I've become good at anything in my life, it's at recognizing when she's plagiarized something. There are these jarring points in the narration that just don't read like her. And again, what does it mean to read like her? I couldn't even tell you what her style is, because it's so slippery, and there's so much intertextuality. But I always recognize when something just it doesn't fit with the storyline. It's a digression. It's a description of a custom, of a tradition. And with the help of modern plagiarism software, I've been able to compare two texts. So I can put, if I have a Word document or a PDF of two texts that have been digitized, for example, I can put them into this search engine, and it'll track if there are parallels. But really the best source for me has been Google. So now what I do is, when I'm reading and something sounds funny, I type it into Google. If the work's been digitized, bam, it comes up, often in Gallica, often in Google Books. So, but that's assuming that the work has been digitized. There are a few where I'm certain she's translated. I haven't been able to find, wow, that was an interesting Freudian slip. There are a few I'm sure she has plagiarized that I haven't been able to find. But it's been quite interesting, and it's been just one of the larger threads that I've tracked throughout the work.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me, just hearing you talking about it, it's interesting how much the tools that we're using now, the digitization and the plagiarism software, you know, all these kind of new tools that we have really helped you to write this book. That's an interesting aspect of it too.
Yeah, and back in the day, you know, she was dismissed in the press as a plagiarist. Briefly, you know, there's a couple of brief references that I've been able to find, and they were very misogynistic. I think they linked it to her gender. You know, she's not creative. She has to copy. She has to mimic. She can't do this on her own. But nobody has actually nobody has really gone to this extreme and said, yeah, every single novel contains something. And my argument is that she's engaging with these male author discourses of femininity, but I can only say that because I don't think if she did copy other women, I don't think those works have been digitized. And so unless we have a really good knowledge of the works from memory, or we've come across them, it's not, I don't know who or if she copied other women. And I do recognize that my reading of that will likely and hopefully change in the next decade as we discover more and more works are digitized. So I mean, the reliance on technology and what's coming next, who knows, but it's exciting for sure.
Yeah. And so then I think it's chapter 4, is about Colette and Missy's pantomime, then Rêve d'Égypte. So you started to tell us a little bit about how you discovered that they actually plagiarized her, Le Rêve de Misses. You want to say a little bit more about that? So is it the Bibliothèque de l'Opéra that you were doing?
Well, actually, when I first got in touch with Michael, who's here, he had been creating a list of Gallica references that he was very kind to share with me. And one of the links that he sent me that he found all the references to La Vaudère and Gallica was just a little paragraph in Le Temps that said something like La Vaudère has been authorized to issue a constat par huissier against the Moulin Rouge for theft of a pantomime that she claims to have circulated. And so again, it's really, this book would never have happened alone. I mean, I owe so much to so many people, and that's what's been so fun about it. And again, it's just the beginning. But I could not find any other traces of this legal case. So either it was dropped because she had no case, or it was not, or it was settled. I don't think it was settled because she took revenge on Missy and Colette in her writing. But one of the things I was able to find, thanks to this man at the Opéra, was at the SACD, they do have a letter that La Vaudère had written to them where she's inquiring about her legal rights and how they can help her to reclaim ownership of this pantomime. This happened right before it was scheduled to go on stage. She had been reading about it in the press. The press was really hyping up this Moulin Rouge production between Missy and this aristocrat and Colette. And she was suspicious. The SACD said, we're sorry, we can't help you because Missy is not one of our members, so there's nothing we can do. We suggest you go look at the courts. It was really interesting because I had been so excited to get my hands on this. There was a procès verbal and her letter. I was so excited to get my hands on it, and I couldn't sleep. It's so silly. But when I got to the archives, the bibliothécaire, she was so lovely, but she said, okay, here you go. We pulled it aside for you. And she started to hand it to me, and I put my hands on it. And she said, actually, wait 1 second. I just have to check with my supervisor. And she pulled it away. And I was like, oh my God, please. So, but it was fun. I didn't have permission to reproduce it in the book, unfortunately, but I think it's probably one of the most exciting discoveries. And then La Vaudère, as I said, published in response. There was no case that she could pursue, but she published her own version, her own novella version that featured a lesbian subplot. And she also wrote this novel called Le Peintre des Frissons, which is, some chapters read as a roman à clé, where she has these two lesbian characters. They're named Minnie and Faunette. And it's a very homophobic portrayal of Colette and Missy, but she claims that they stole a pantomime This is in the novel. She claims that they stole a pantomime that's actually called Le Rêve de Nices. So she gives it its original name, and then she inserts the original pantomime, her verse, into the novel. No lesbian subplot at this point. Then later she adds the lesbian subplot with the nude photography. So it's quite an interesting back and forth and revision, where all three of these people were taking advantage of the scandal, and they were all profiting from it. When Colette and Missy, when their production was canceled, Colette wrote to the mime Georges Vague. He was going to replace Missy in future productions. I think they were going to Nice to resume, and she said, I saw this letter. She said, I think we can still get something out of this. I think there's a lot to profit from this scandal. So they were all aware. They were all aware of it, and I think it ultimately worked to their advantage. When we talk about Colette today, that's in the popular imagination. That's the image we see. The one thing that I think a lot of people in popular culture know is that kiss on stage.
Definitely no. Well, it's fascinating, and there's so much that we can say about this book. I'm looking at the time and mindful, and
oh my God, yeah.
There's a lot of questions in the chat too. So I think maybe I'll just go to the chat. I just want to make sure that all the questions, everyone gets a chance to ask their questions. So if that's okay with you, Sharon, is that all right if I just read some of the ones from the chat?
Totally.
All right. So
you're the boss, Margot.
Oh well. Okay, so we had some people who had to saying they love the talk, but they're having to leave. Melanie asks, can you tell us more about her relations with other women writers of the period? It sounds like La Fronde was hostile, some collaboration with Colette and Missy, well, collaboration, but was she connected to other networks, writers, or was she working in isolation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I cannot find anything. What I can tell you is she definitely rubbed elbows with these women, with other women writers at the Société des gens de lettres at the dinners. She ran for a place on the committee with 4 or 5 other women. She did not win. She did not get any votes. But we had Camille Père, Danielle Husser, somebody else. That she ran against. So they were definitely crossing paths. I have not been able to, she has not engaged with them in any form, in any editorials. There was a brief exchange with a journalist from La Fronde where Vaudère wrote something rather conservative about women in the family. She went back and forth, but she a lot of times did say that, you know, if we want women to be good mothers, if we want women to be good wives, we need to give them sexual education. So this was something that was a contradiction in her writing. All that to say, she did publish an editorial where she was saying, you know, women need to be good mothers, they need to be good wives. And there was a back and forth with a journalist at the La Fronde who called her an anti-feminist. Other than that, I don't have any idea of what if she collaborated. She collaborated with a few male writers. It's possible she used a pseudonym that I'm not aware of. I do know of 2 or 3 pseudonyms she used that I have been able to document. It's possible she did collaborate with other women writers and I'm not aware of it. She collaborated with a woman named Jeanne Vieux, who was a singer. She wrote the verse for a lot of her works. But other than that, I have not been able to find anything. I don't think she was part of a network of women. She was very eccentric, and she did not like organized feminism. She thought it was impractical. She thought it was elitist, but she had these feminist themes in her writing. So it would not surprise me to learn that she was not part of any larger networks. She also, as I don't know if Rachel is still here, she maybe once appeared in those literary women magazines that Féminin La Vie Heureuse, just one time briefly alongside a lot of those women writers, because as Rachel showed, she was just a little bit, she wasn't conventional enough. She didn't have those bourgeois values of womanhood to be part of those magazines. So I wish I had a better answer. TBD. It's something to work on for sure.
Yeah, really interesting. I'll go back to, so Manon Hakem-Lemaire asked, I wasn't familiar with Jean de la Vaudère, but I'm working on 19th century travel literature by men and women for my dissertation. And I worked on Maupassant short stories with Margot Irvine for my MA. I wonder how closely she plagiarized him, if more in terms of plot or style or both.
Well, I don't know if you're familiar with Notre Coeur. Let's see, oops, I just lost the question. You're talking about his short stories. It wouldn't surprise me. It's very easy. All you have to do is, if you want to read, well, let me think, what short stories of his? I have not come across any short stories of his that she's plagiarized. A few different novels and obviously the travel memoirs, but it would not surprise me at all. If you're interested in that, you I'll tell you the name of the plagiarism software I use. It's called Jester with a J, J-E-S-T-E-R. J-E-S-T-E-R. And you can put in different, this is the software you can put in different texts and they'll read them against each other. I'm sure there are others out there, but that one's not payant, so that was the one I chose. We're all teachers, so if your institution may have access to plagiarism software. When you read La Vaudère, if there's a strange digression, if there's a weird parenthetical, if she just sort of goes off and talks about ancient customs, it's probably not hers. Any sort of elaborate, overly elegant style is also probably not hers. That wasn't really her. I see David has a question about voice. It wasn't really her voice. She was more of her style was more, I would say, in the popular fiction. Even though she's characterized as a decadent, I don't think she has the aesthetic. She definitely has the themes. So yeah, it's going to take more research. It's a great question.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything more about David's question? I just lost it there in the.
Yeah, I guess I don't.
Yeah.
Talks about voice.
Yeah, jumping off your mark that have the notion of La Vaudère's style. I was hoping you might talk some about voice. Yeah.
Yeah, David, can you elaborate a little bit what you mean by voice?
Sure. Can you hear me there?
Yep.
I was wondering, long before you made that commentary, I was thinking about the mummification metaphors, the wrapping herself in so many other people's works, and then you started to talk about plagiarism. So for me, it sort of became a huge obstacle on how can you define her voice. Did she discover her own voice, in your opinion?
I think her voice was her lack of voice. I think her voice was the fluidity of her voice. I think I see it also as very much linked to her persona. I think she really did not want to be pinned down, which has been one of the difficulties in writing this book and how to describe her. I think that's what makes her unique. She was constantly shifting with the times. There's not one consistent voice or style of hers that emerges, and she was always in dialogue with those around her and with the social issues that were coming up. So I don't think it, as we understand it, I don't think she can be reduced to having a voice. I think this is all very much linked to her malleability, her fluidity. And that's what made her who she was. Very, ironically and paradoxically, it's her lack of one identity, her lack of one very distinct and what's the word I'm looking for? Unique, recognizable voice. It's just I don't see it that way. She's in constant movement. It's a fascinating question though. I'm going to think more about that. Thank you, David.
It sounds like she made, well, I'm going to make a leap here, that perhaps it was a conscious decision that she will not be essentialized, en principe, Right.
Right.
Thank you, Sharon.
Yeah, that's the irony. She's writing against all these essentialist notions of gender, and at the same time also clinging to them. But in doing so, she's all over the place, and she's inhabiting all these different identities and voices, as you say. And so it's quite interesting. There's a lot there, and I'm gonna keep going. This is not the end, and I hope to meet more lovely people along the way, because that's what's been so cool about these networks.
Well, maybe I'll just grab the last question if I can, then to ask you what comes next, because it is 3 o'clock, unfortunately. So I think we'll have to end. But I'm curious about what's the next project for you? What can we look forward to now that the book's out?
Yeah, I have a new folder on my desktop. It's called Post-Book La Vaudère. So it's all the, I have Google alerts. I'm constantly checking Gallica. I'm constantly in touch with other people who are working on her. But the biggest, I'm going up for sabbatical. I have to have a project, and I'm thinking, what can I do here? My biggest hope is to get in touch with these archives nationales and see what is in those boxes. And again, I open this up to my lovely colleagues. If you have any advice on how to do this, I've emailed them twice. As a control freak, I want to get in there and get my hands dirty and see for myself. I know that's not an option, but any advice on how to sort of get them to inventory this a little quicker in the next 20 years or so, that would be great. No, Institute Library. No, I have not. That's a good lead. Thank you.
So thank you both so much. We need to stop the recording now, but please join me in thanking Sharon and Margot for this wonderful presentation.